The Mishnah tells us on Daf Beis Amid Beis that if a woman is an erva, one of the 15 categories of arayos, but she turns out, to our surprise, to be an islandess, so that even though she's an erva who would, under normal conditions, had she not been an islandess, she would pater up hatzara from Yibum, but in this case, she's not considered part of Yibum because she turned out to be an islandess, and therefore, even though she's an erva, hatzara is misyabem, she falls for Yibum. And the simple pshat, the way Rashi and Tos seem to interpret it, is that in the case of an islandess, it's mekach tos, which means that under these conditions, had he known that she were an islandess, he never would have married. So therefore, he was never married, and we're oker the kedusha l'mafreya, and that's based on the halach of tos, which is a universal concept in halacha that you enter into a transaction under false conditions, you have false assumptions. And therefore, there's no tsaras erev over here because she's never been married to Shimon, who died, right? Because Shimon, had he known about the fact that she would be an islandess, he never would have married. And Tosfos raises the following problem. The Gemara later on has a shita of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir says, and you can see this right at the top of Tosfos Dibra Maskal Oshanimtza Islandess, on Daf Samach Aleph Amid Beis, Katan Uktana Lo Choltzin V'Lo B'Yavmin. So let's say Shimon married a woman, and she's an erva to Reuven, his brother, but she's a Ketana. And now Shimon dies when his wife is still a Ketana. And in such a case, there's no Yibum. Says Rabbi Meir, why is there no Yibum in that case? After all, I said that she was an erva. I was confusing our Mishnah. The Gemara over there is talking about a case where she's not an erva to Reuven. It's a classic scenario of Yibum. And yet, Reuven will not be miyabem, the wife of the late Shimon, because she's a ketana, and Shema timtza islandess. Maybe she'll turn out to be an islandess. Now, Tosfos says, it doesn't make any sense. If she's not an islandess, then she falls for Yibum. So why shouldn't Reuven be miyabima? And if on the outside chance that she turns out to be an islandess, so there was never a marriage to Shimon to begin with, and therefore there's no erva of Eishes Achiv. So why does Rabbi Meir prohibit a Yibum relationship in the case of a Ketana based on Shema, the possibility that Timtza islandess? Either way, there shouldn't be any problem in Reuven being miyabem, his Shimon's late wife, who's a Ketana. It might not be, because if it turns out that she's an islandess, then Shimon was never married to her, so she didn't fall for Yibum. But it's okay to marry, Shimon's wife if there's no Yibum on the side that Shimon was never married to her. Right? The only erev of Eishes Achiv is because she was actually married to his brother Shimon. And if there's no mitzvah of Yibum, then he's being pogea an erev of Eishes Achiv. But if they were never married, so we want to shock either they were married and she's not an islandess, and therefore she falls for Yibum to Reuven. And if in the worst case scenario she's an islandess, she was never married to Shimon, and therefore she's not an erva to Reuven of Eishes Achiv, he can marry. The Tosfos presents two answers to this question, and basically two explanations for the statement of Rabbi Meir in the sugya later on about Ketana, Lo Misyabemes, Chayshin and Shemet Timtza Island. The first answer is that of Rabbeinu Tam. And what we want to do today is we want to study the two answers and the difference between them, and then move on to two answers that are given by the Achronim. So Rabbeinu Tam's answer is that Hahi, the sugya of Rabbi Meir of Ketana, is a case of Kibla Iluye, which means that Shimon made a statement in the context of his marriage to this woman that even if, in event, she turns out to be an islandess, I accept her as Kedushin. I validate the marriage relationship. I don't care. Even if she's an islandess, this is the love of my life. Very romantic scene. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Tam, in that particular scenario of Kibla Alayu, we now begin to understand Reb Meir's nervous tension. Why? Because we now have a guarantee that even if she turns out to be an islandess, her marriage relationship with Shimon is valid. And there's no Yibum. Why is there no Yibum? Because the Torah says in the Parsha of Yibum, in Parshas Kitei, it says, Asher Yulat, that a child will be born to this woman as a result of Yibum, Asher Teled, and the Gemara derives from those words, Asher Teled Prat La'island, Sheina Ru'yu Laholik. So she's not in the Parsha of Yibum. Now she turns out to be married to Shimon with a valid marriage, but without Yibum. And that makes her into Eishes Achiv as far as Reuben is concerned. Then Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Avram. And you'll see this approximately 9 lines down from the top of the Tosfos. Vishenimtes Eilenis Bechaye Ha'af. It means that our Mishnah says that the tzara of an islandess falls for Yibum, she's muteres, is a case of nimtes islandess b'chaye ha'av. We find out that during that during the lifetime of Shimon, his wife is an islandess, vehikpid. And Shimon made a declaration, I'm out of here. I don't want to be married to an islandess. This is Kiddushay Tos. And in such a case, the former wife or the supposed wife of Shimon, who now, as it turns out, retroactively we know is not his wife, she doesn't fall for Yibum, and therefore she, if she's an Ereva, does not create a Tzoras Ereva, Ptur of Tzoras Ereva. Aval. But in the case, in the Gemara later on Daf Samach Beis, there, the case of Ketana Einimis Yabem Hashem Timsa Islands, that's the case where we only find out the Achar Misa after Shimon died that she was an islandess. And in such a case, we have to consider the possibility that Dilma im hayakayim lo hayamak. In other words, when we hear from the Baal, that's Shimon, that he wants out of this marriage when he finds out she's an islandess, and that's the case of our Mishnah, then clearly the deal is off. She's a Mekato situation, and Hatzara is Misyabenis. But what Reb Meir is talking about is a case where they didn't find out that she was an islandess. They didn't discover this. That's why the Lashon is Ketana, because during her katnus, there's no way that we can find out and determine that she's an islandess. So now Shimon dies. He leaves his wife, who's a Ketana, and we find out that discover after Shimon's death, that she's an islandess. And now we have to raise the possibility, says Rabbeinu Avram, that had the husband known during his lifetime that she's an islandess, maybe just the opposite. Instead of being makpid, he would declare, I'm not makpid. We don't know. There's no way that we can determine. Again, I would add, as we'll soon see in Rebbe Kivega, it's probably unlikely that he would accept her marriage, but there certainly is a statistical possibility that could happen. And now we have to add the following, because Rabbeinu Avram doesn't spell this out. Okay, so let's say the husband would, had he known during his lifetime, he would have declared, I'm not makpid. So now we go back to square one, and we apply the principle Asher Teled. And Asher Teled, Prat La'islands. Now, if he would have been makpid, then there was no marriage. So there's no reason to be hesitant, inhibited about Yibum, because she was never married to Shimon. But on that side, that maybe perhaps Shimon, had he known during his lifetime, would have accepted that marriage. Then now what kicks in is the pasuk Asher Teled Prat La'islands, which means there's no mitzvah Yibum in this case. So here's the situation where, according to one side in the possibilities, Shimon is married to a woman. Shimon dies, and this woman is excluded from the parasha of Yibum because we found out that she is an islandess and she's not included in Asher Telech, in which case she becomes an Eishes Ach. Again, if we would have been absolutely convinced that Shimon would be Makbid, then we have no problem with Eishes Ach because she was never married to Shimon. And it's a Mekach Tos. But now that Rabbi Avram is raising the possibility, as a serious halachic possibility, that maybe Shimon, had he known in his lifetime, would not have been makpid, and he would have validated and certified the marriage. Then, since she's excluded from Yibum, she's an Eishes Ach. That's why the Gemara in Samach Beis, the Gemara on Samach Aleph on Beis, going on to Samach Beis, in the name of Rabbi Meir, says we cannot allow Yibum to take place if the establishment of her status as an islandess did not emerge during the lifetime of her husband Shimon, but rather posthumously. And we have to be worried about the possibility that Shimon, had he known in his lifetime, he would have accepted and validated the marriage. Let's try to summarize then the machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Avram. And I'm basing myself on the fact that Tosfos now goes ahead and quotes a Tosefta, and the Tosefta says explicitly, Nimtzu Eilinus, Bein V'chayaba, Bein Liachar Misa, Sorosein Mutaros. So the Tosefta addresses explicitly the scenario that Rabbeinu Avram was talking about, that we only found out after the Misa of the Baal, after Shimon died, that his wife is an islandess, and yet it says in the Brisa, Sorosehen Mutaros, which means that we're going to assume a Mekach Tos. Because again, if you're going to validate the marriage because of Rabbeinu Avram's logic that maybe had he known, Shimon would have known during his lifetime, blah, 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 he would have accepted the marriage, then the tzara is a tzaras erva. And yet, as a comment, an addendum on our Mishnah, where it says tzarasei and mutaros, the Tosefta says, even if we found out that she's an islandess liachar misa, how can we allow a yibum to the tzara? She's a tzaras erva. On the side that maybe Shimon, had he known in his lifetime, would have accepted the marriage below makpid, then she is a tzaras erva. Obviously, says Tosfos, we have to conclude that our assumption is, unless proven otherwise, that he would not be happy being married to an islandess. And that's a very strong premise on our part. And we're going to operate with that premise. So that's what forced Rabbeinu Tam into a corner, and he interpreted Hahi Bekibla Iluye, that the circumstance in the Gemara of Rabbi Meir is, and he says Kashina and Shema Timsa Islandess, is got to be a case of Kibla Iluye, where in fact the Baal found out, or alternatively, we can assume had he found out the case of Rabbi Meir is where a man marries a Ketana under the condition with an explicit declaration, I will remain married to her, even if it turns out that she's an islandess. And therefore, says Rabbi Meir, we cannot allow Yibum if Shimon dies, because now we have to worry about the possibility that she may turn out to be an islandess, and she's not included in the parsha of Yibum. She's an Eishes Ach. But apparently, Rabbeinu Tam could not accept the theoretical possibility that even though he didn't explicitly make that declaration that he's accepting her as such, that maybe he would have accepted as such if he would have known, if the knowledge was denied to him because she became determined to be an islandess after he died, that whole possibility is non-tenable according to Rabbeinu Tam. We always assume until we know otherwise that he does not want to be married to an idoless. And the Tosefta now will support Rabbeinu Tam against Rabbeinu Avram. Rabbeinu Avram raises the possibility that maybe we should consider halachically if he didn't know during his lifetime and we can second guess the possibility or raise the possibility that had he known during his lifetime, he would have accepted her, and therefore she's Eishes Achiv, and an Erev she doesn't fall for Yibum because of Hashem. In trying to analyze this machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam, which really represents the sheet of Tosfos against Rabbeinu Avram, I'm tempted to assume the following: that Rabbeinu Avram is very motivated by a chazaka principle that goes as follows: Ein adam otze bilaso bilas nus. Meaning, Rabbeinu Avram is not going to argue against Rabbeinu Tam on the point that, oh, well, maybe he'll be okay with the fact that she's an islandess. That's very, very unlikely. But Rabbeinu Avram is balancing that with an opposing force called chazak ein arosim bilaso bilas nus. The very fact that a man is married to a woman and he continues in that marriage relationship, and he would despise a situation in which all that marriage and all the intimacies turn out to be bias nus, that's something that's absolutely despicable. That counters the other chazaka that says a man marries a woman because he expects that she can bring children into the world. Rabbeinu Tam, on the other hand, is so loyal and he's so hung up, if you will, on this chazaka that a person wants to marry a woman who's capable of having children. He's bootstrapped when he finds out that she's an islandess. That clearly he doesn't want to be married to her, but comes along Rabbeinu Avram and he says, but wait a second. If he's not married to her, then what about all these years of intimacy of marriage? You know, that framework is just gone. We blow it out of the... Now, I wanted to introduce two other approaches to answer Tosfos' kasha, and you'll see this on page Ches, if you have it, on the left column, numbers Hey and Vav. And we'll start with Rabbi Kivega, number Hey. Af shekidushe islandess, hey mekach tos, ein ze ele berov b'nei adam hamakpidim al kach. Rabbi Kivega says the following: that when we try to justify and interpret the Gemara in Yevamot Samach Aleph on days, that Rabbi Meir would not permit a katana to fall for Yibum in a way that Ruvain would be miyaving this katana, the emphasis should be placed on Rabbi Meir. He's the one at fault, so to speak. Why? Because Rabbi Meir has a shita in Kol HaTorah Kula called Chayshinon L'miuta, that although the Torah says Achrei Rabim Lahatos, that we rely on the evidence of Rov, but nevertheless, if there is a significant minority, not 40%, but let's say 5%, but there's some possibility that is statistically significant and has an element of probability, we should have to be choshesh l'miyuta lechumra, and halacha must relate to the miyut, so that we can begin to appreciate Rabbeinu Avram, who claims that the Gemara of Ketana Eina Misyabemet Shemet Timsa Islandis is a reflection of the Shita of Rabbi Meir, his unique Shita. Rabbi Tam is right. What are the chances that a man will say, I want to remain married even if she's an islandess? Very slim, but significant enough such that Rabbi Meir, who's Choshesh L'mi'uta, would consider that as a halachic legal probability. Again, when I say probability, I don't mean that it's probable, but I mean in probability theory, it's significant enough. Now, add that to the probability, again, insignificant, but significant enough for Rabbi Meir, of probability that she might turn out to be an islandess. Now, if you combine those two, you have A, the possibility that she'll turn out to be an islandess, and B, the possibility that this particular Baal, called him Shimon, would accept that marriage. When you add A plus B, it's very explosive, because what happens is that if we have to consider that miyut, that Shimon would accept this marriage, then her status vis-a-vis Reuven is that of Eshes Achiv Shalom B'Makom, because she's an islandess. Rabbi Meir l'shitaso choshesh l'miyut, v'choshesh af l'miyut anoshim she'ein makpidim al kach. V'al kein einu misyabemes ki shema hi mi'hamiyut anoshim she'ein islandess, v'shema baal hu mimiyut anoshim she'ein makpidim al kach. V'lo haya mevatel as a kedusha mishum kach. So the Aruch LaNer, who was almost the contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, a little bit later perhaps, a younger contemporary, he doesn't understand. The Gemara says all over the place that Rabbi Meir is choshesh l'mi'uta, but not mi'uta dimi'uta, which means that even Rabbi Meir requires, in order to be choshesh l'mi'ut, that the mi'ut be somewhat significant. Now, let's turn out the probability here. What are the chances that this woman is an islandess? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 100? Now add to that, what are the chances that this Baal would accept the marriage had he known that she was an islandess? 1 in 50? You begin to add it's very unlikely. And therefore the Aruch LaNer says to interpret this Gemara in the light of Rabbi Meir of Chayshina L'mi'uta, that doesn't make any sense. I would like to suggest an answer, or possibly two answers, to the Aruch LaNer. Explain Rabbi Akiva. Number one, we have to paskin on a miyut as a separate psak on the question that's being asked of us. Every question, every suffix in halacha requires a hachra, a decision. What is the law in such a case? Is it vaday this? Is it vaday that? Is it a suffix? Do we have to be choshesh for miyut? We have to answer each question individually. Rabbi Akiva is arguing that according to Rabbi Meir, we're not going to look at the overall statistics. We have to focus and single out every single suffix. And we have to know whether rov and miyut will be chal vis-a-vis that suffix. And we have one suffix on one gavra and another suffix on another gavra. We want to know, number one, whether or not she is an islandess. Rabbi Meir says, Chayshina L'miyuta. We look at her, we don't know her biological future, and we have to consider, according to halacha, the 1 in 100, I don't know what it is. I'd like to say it's a high percentage, because otherwise, even the possibility that she's an islandess is miyuta to miyuta. And then the Aruch HaShulchan, has an open and shut victory over the Rabbeinu Tam. But I think it's significant enough that we have to be choshesh that she is an islandess. Now we have another issue. Would he be the type of person who would accept a marriage and validate despite the fact that she's an islandess? And that's a separate question. And there are a group of people out there, percentage-wise, that would accept the marriage. And on that, we apply the principle of cheshino miuta, that miut has a chalot shem. And therefore, Rabbi Kivega is correct in analyzing Rabbi Meir that we're not going to turn out, we're not going to throw into this cholin both the question of whether she's an islandess, the question whether he would accept the marriage despite, and then come up with a ridiculously low percentile. But rather, we're going to separate the two. And Mashal Lamad over Dome, it's a little bit similar to what we call spek b'shnei guf. What does that mean? Like, let's say you find a tarnagolis that was slaughtered, and you don't know, number one, whether or not it was a treifa, and number two, whether or not the shochet was kosher l'shchita. Do you want to create a spek? You want to say the following: I'm going to assume it's not a treifa. And even if you'll tell me, one second. Let me get this the specs. Let me give it a better scenario. Let's say I don't know if this piece of meat is kosher or treifa, and then it falls into a mixture. So do I have the right to say the following? I have a specs. One suffix is the piece of meat that I take out of this mixture. I don't know if that's the piece of questionable meat that fell in. And another suffix is that even if it's that questionable piece of meat, maybe it was kosher and not treifa. So that's called suffix echad beguf and suffix echad b'tarofos. I have one suffix as to whether or not this piece is the bad piece, the one that's marked red, or it's one of the other pieces. And then I have another suffix about the piece that fell in, which is marked red, whether or not that's true. And we don't accept such a spec. Why? Because every issue has to be analyzed independently. First, we'll determine what's the halacha in the taros, and then we're going to determine what's the halacha in the suffix in the guf hamid. And that's Rabbi Kivega, we have to raise a suffix about her status. Could she possibly be an islandess? And about his psychological attitude towards, well, what happens if she is an islandess? Now, the other way of answering the Aruch LaNer's kasha is by differentiating between two roves. We have a rove that is in nature, and we have a rove that's in psychology. So, for example, what percentage of people walking on 2 feet are treifos, that they'll die within a year? They have some sort of internal. So here we have a rove, and that rove is a rove that's based on nature. Biologically, we assume that a person who's walking on 2 feet is healthy. Again, there are a lot of people who are paranoid and they think they're not healthy, but hopefully we're not so paranoid. And then you have a different kind of a rove that's built on psychology. If I would tell you that the average yeshiva bachur wears a black hat, so that's a psychological rove. There's nothing biological. There's nothing in the creation of the world that means that you have to wear a black hat. Well, most rabbis wear a black hat. But that's a question of psychology. So whether or not a person in the framework of marriage would want to continue, even if he finds out she's an islandess, that's a psychological issue. And rove, even Rabbi Kivega will concede that rove men would not be happy with a woman who turns out to be an islandess. Comes along the Aruch LaNer and he says, well, so what? I mean, you're right. Essentially, there are two categories of rov here, but at the end of the day, you're dealing with miuta to miuta. What are the statistical probabilities that A, she'll turn out to be an islandess, and B, he'll turn out to be that guy who wants to remain married? But it could be that Rabbi Kiva Eger would hold that under certain circumstances, if we don't have a clear-cut biological rove, then any sort of miut is to be considered a miut. What do I mean? Again, going over Rabbi Kiva Eger's language, he says, Rov b'nei adam akpidim al zeh. Aval Rabbi Meir l'shitaso choshesh l'miuta, choshesh af l'miut anoshim she'eno makpidim al kach. When you're dealing with psychology, Rabbi Meir says, I don't know, there's so many different variables that go into the equation here. Like we mentioned before, it's uncomfortable for him to invalidate and annul the marriage, retroactively because he's been living. There's so many different issues. And it's so subjective and it changes from one person to the other that Rabbi Meir is not willing to rely on such a rule. So what I'm suggesting now is that there may be two halachas in Rabbi Meir. One halacha is that a viable rov still has a miut, and the miut is also to be reckoned with in halacha. And that would apply to a biological rov. So, for example, the Gemara says that most women give birth after 9 months, not after 7 months. And if she was married to two men, and we don't know if this child was born to the first husband or the second husband, we could assume that she would have given birth after 9 months. Do you follow what I mean? Mm-hmm. That biological rove is a very strong rove. It's built into the nature of the universe, the way God created it. If all things are equal, a woman is healthy, she'll carry to full term 9 months. Same thing is here. If all things are equal, in nature, a woman is not an islandess. She'll develop the proper simonim and she could have children. Now, in this case, Rabbi Meir is saying something entirely different. Haishina lemiuta here, according to Rabbi Meir, in the case of a bona fide rove that's built on nature, is an entirely different halacha. It's not a question of, well, the rove is not reliable. Maybe this yeshiva guy says, I don't like a black hat, it's too heavy on my head, or, it gets squished and squashed, I can't afford a Borsellino and keep up with the Joneses. There are a million different reasons. That's not a reliable rove. That's not Reb Meir. Reb Meir is saying that Chayshina Lemiuta, again, I wish I had a Gemara Chulin to double check this, but Chayshina Lemiuta applies even in an absolute bona fide rove that's built on God's nature. You have to keep a small shas. There is one, here. But I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that Reb Meir goes as far as Chayshina Lemiuta, even in a case of what the Gemara calls a Ruba de Isa Kamon. It's a rove that, that we can touch with our hands. It's a natural rove. Now, if you have two flimsy kind of roves, then Rabbi Meir is going to admit that I'm sorry, let me go back. Yeah, in other words, if the Aruch LaNer, let me start it this way, would concede to Rabbi Kiva Eger. No, I'm sorry. Rabbi Kiva Eger would concede to the Aruch LaNer that if you have two very wishy-washy roves that are based on psychology and they can change overnight, if you would take a psychology textbook from our youth and you read certain things that sound so strange to our ears, the days when they were watching black and white television and saying so many things have changed over the course of time. So if you would put two of those robes together, Rabbi Meir would admit that it's a mute of the mute. Then no, 1 second. I'm making the same mistake. That in such a case, I'm sorry. I wanted to say it the other way around. That if you have two reliable robes that are predicated on nature, then Rabbi Akiva would admit to the position of the Archelaner that Rabbi Meir would rely on two solid robes and he would not combine the two mutes together. And lo chayshinon lemiyuta demiyuta. But if you would have two robes, both of which are psychological in nature, then Rabbi Meir, and it could be even the Archelaner would agree, would say the chayshinon even lemiyuta, because each robe is very iffy, and we could be choshesh in each robe for the mute. The machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Archelaner is about a case we have two robes, one of which is an absolute reliable robe built on nature, and the other robe is a psychological robe. Can I put these two mutes together and apply as the Archelaner shita would be, this is miyuta de miyuta, and miyuta lo chashin? Or do we say no, that already with regard to the robe of most women are not islanders? Let's start with the other robe. The robe of husbands will be makpid. Rabbi Meir disqualifies that. And therefore, what you're left with is only one mute, the mute in a bona fide, reliable robe of nature. And Rabbi Meir comes up with a new halacha called chayshin l'miyut, that every robe has its mute, and the halacha has to consider its mute. Now we get to the Pnei Yoshua and the Rashash. Tirtzu al pi divrei Rashi begitin. He tells you in the footnote that this is a sugya in Gittin on Daf Mem Vav Amid Beis. Ein kiddushay island is mekaftos ela ad shekonas osa. So now Rabbi Osa, I'm going to introduce that chazaka that I mentioned earlier called Ein Adam Osa Bilaso Bilas Nus. There are two stages in marriage. One is Erusin and then is Nesuin or Chuppah. As long as he's in the stage of Erusin and he finds out that his wife is an islandess, then for sure he doesn't want to be married to an islandess. But if he went ahead and he made a decision, I'm going to go to the next level of marriage, and he's kones holach chuppah, which means that he has an intimate relationship with her. At that point, what kicks in is the principle called chazaka ein adam osa bilasa bilas nus. And Rashi therefore says that if you want to talk about kiddushay tos, that's in a state of erusin before nesuin. Avaliacha sheba aleha. Once he consummates the marriage with nesuin, harei hu misratze b'kiddushin. He makes a decision in his heart of hearts that I want to be married to this woman. Afal pishet imotze, even if in the worst case scenario it turns out to be an house. Mishum she'in yisbatlu ha'kiddushin. Because if he will if he will negate the kiddushin, heichoshev be'ilaso lebilasnus, ve'ein adam osas be'ilaso bilasnus. Says the Pnei Yoshua. Now we have an answer to Tos's kasha. Es mishnah senu yesh lahamid shenimtza island is kodem sheba'aleha. And why do we say that this is an assumption of kiddushay tos, and therefore the erva, the saras erva is misyabemes, is because we assume that a man does not want to be married to an islandess. Ay, masha osa Rabbi Meir es haktana b'yibum. What about Rabbi Meir, who says that when Shimon's wife falls for Yibum, and now she's a Ketana, we have to be choshesh that maybe she'll turn out to be an islandess, which means that she's in the Parsha, that she is married to Shimon, and yet there's no Yibum. Why? Because she's an islandess, and there's no Yibum to an islandess because Asher Tele, and yet the marriage is valid. How could that be? And the answer is, Rabbi Meir is talking about a case, which is 99.9 out of 100 cases, that he married this Ketana and he consummated the marriage. The very moment he consummates the marriage, what kicks in is the chazaka ain't on the most avilos. And therefore, he would not want to make a declaration, I'm out of here, I don't want this marriage. And if he wants this marriage to be islanders, then we have a problem of Eishes Ach. Why? Because there's no mitzvah of Yibum in the case. Okay, now what we want to do, before we go on to page test, let's sort of make a marker here and go back to the Mishnah. We're now in Daf Beis Amud Beis, and we're up to line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, line 5. Ve'iyata yochel lomar bechamoso v'em chamoso v'em chamiv shenimtzu islandis o shemian. We just finished saying in the Mishnah that if the erva, one of the 15 categories, turns out to be an islandess, or if it's a case where she was married off by her brother or her mother as a ketana, and then she's mema'enes, in those cases, the tzara falls for Yibum, because there is no marriage. One second. Right. So let's say, according to Rabbeinu Tam, during his lifetime, he finds out, Shimon finds out she's an islandess, he makes a declaration on Makbid and to Mekatos, and therefore she doesn't fall for Yibum, and the Tzara, therefore, is Misyab Ben. Now the Mishnah says that there are a number of women that are listed as Arayos in the 15 that, by definition, are neither islanders, they cannot be an islandess, nor can they be a Mama'enes situation. What are those cases? Those are cases of Chamoso, etc. Because Chamoso means that Reuven was married to the daughter of this woman who fell for Yibum, meaning his mother-in-law falls for Yibum. Like, let's say, for example, if Shimon marries, right? Let's say it easier. If Reuven and Shimon marry a mother and a daughter, so now Shimon is married to Reuven's mother-in-law, and that means that Reuven is married to Shimon's wife's daughter, because they married mother and daughter. That can only be possible if the Erev of Chamoso is a Gedola, because the assumption is a Ketana can't have children. So how could it be that Reuven's married to the daughter of this woman we call Sarah, who is Shimon's wife, unless Sarah is a Gedola? If Sarah is a Gedola, then there's no Kiddushay Mir. And not only that, she cannot be an islandess because an islandess can't give birth. Okay. And of course, that's going to be true for Eim Chamosa and Eim Chamiv. all of these are by definition Gidolos, so there's no miyun, and mothers, and therefore she can't be an idols. And on this, we have a kashiv tosus here, Dibra Maskil, Iata Yochel Lomar, etc. Now, to appreciate this tosus, we need to know something about Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. Now, I'm just going to try to see, at least on the first round of going through this tosis, if we can find a little bit of a shortcut. Tosis says, "V'im tomish kachas le'mion b'kduchei tos, the Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel afilu b'no murkav al kseifa v'ma'enes v'oleches." And this is a sugya on Daf Kuf Amid Beis. So we're literally fast forwarding by 100 blocks in MASECHET Yevamot. And basically, what Tosus is going to try to prove from Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel at the end of the Masechta is that you could have a case of Kiddushay Miyun by Chamosa. There could be such an entity. So if you look at the bottom of page Ches that I photocopied for you, he gives you a summary or an overview of Rabbi Shmuel's Shita and why Tosus is bothered by Rabbi Shmuel. Tana shehisia acheha ve'ima. This is the classic Kiddushay Miyun, where a girl who's less than 12 years old was married off by her brother or by her mother. And Rabbi Shmuel says that the marriage itself is d'Rabbanan. And regarding that marriage that's d'Rabbanan, because it wasn't the father who married her off, there's a halacha of miyun. The Rabbanan recognized and validated miyun. There's no need for a get in order to terminate that marriage relationship, which is only the Rabbanan. Comes along Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel, and he has an answer to the following question: what happens if right now she's a gedola? We know that the marriage itself was to a katana, and that was a marriage that lends itself to miyun. But what happens now? She already passes bat mitzvah. Is there still a halach of miyun? And Rabbi Shmuel's answer is in the affirmative. There is miyun even li'achar shetagdil. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel rejects the following position, which the Chachamim insist on, that it's Kiddushay Miyun as long as she's a katana. With her gadlus, her bagrus, what emerges is an absolute change in the quality of the ishus. It now gets upgraded to ishus doraisa, and she needs a get. Is therefore, says Tosfos, matzinu, we now have a possibility of chamoso mima enes. How could you have chamoso mima enes, which means that this woman gave birth, and in this case, Reuben is married to her daughter, to the girl that she gave birth to. Well, wait a minute, if she gave birth, then she's already a gedola, because a katana can't give birth. And if she's a gedola, then there should not be any miyun. And that was the logic of our Mishnah. But that's not true according to Rabbi Shmuel, because according to Rabbi Shmuel, there's miyun even if she's a gedola. That means she could have had a baby, and yet she's still subject to Kiddushay miyun, because the etzem, the essential ishus as it emerged when he first married her, was that of an ishus to a katana, that's Kiddushay miyun. And Rabbi Shmuel insists that it remains Kedushay Miyun even after she becomes older. It's not that just because she, we celebrated her bat mitzvah, we took her out to a restaurant, that therefore automatically the Ishus emerges and it becomes Ishus Doraisa. It's not a magical transition. It's Ishus Dorabanan even after she became a Gedolah.
What's the status of
the Ketubah? I don't know enough about Kedushay Miyun to answer your question. I would assume that there's no Ksubah in the case of Kedushay Miyun, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yishmael, nothing changes when she becomes Bat Mitzvah. But again, I don't know enough about Kedushay Miyun to answer your question. Keep going. Tosfos gives a scenario. Shenises, here I like to see if I can find a piece of paper here. Let me try to. Okay, I'll scratch it out here. Let's see. Kegon shenises li achiv bikatnusa. Oh, so I think nises li achiv means to Shimon. He doesn't give it names, unfortunately. Okay, fine. So let's call her, I don't know, we'll call her Sarah. So Shimon marries Sarah, and Sarah's a Ketana. And Shimon has a brother named Reuven. Now Sarah becomes a Gedolah and continues in her marriage relationship with Shimon and gives birth to a baby. What should we call her? I'll call her Leah. I don't know. Is that okay? So Leah is the daughter of Sarah, which means that when Reuven marries Leah, Sarah is his mother, correct? Benasa hu bat zu, and he, Reuven, marries this daughter, Leah, the daughter of Sarah. The achakach mesa ishto. Just 1 second. Wait a minute. A little bit ambiguous. So wait a minute. Whose wife died? It seems that Leah dies. Not sure exactly why that's. Oh, I see. Yeah, he wants Leah out of the picture because otherwise, if Shimon dies and leaves Sarah, so Sarah, his wife's mother. 1 second, I'm sorry. At this point, I wish he would have clarified this. But in any event, the achakach. Okay, now what happened there? Again, I just, if you can underline those words, achakach mesa ishto, because I don't know what, I'm not sure where that fits into the puzzle. But the achakach miana chamoso bi achiv. Okay, now Sarah declares she's out of the marriage with Shimon. Again, she's now 15 years old or 25 years old. I don't care how old. She's already a mother, but she does miyun according to Rabbi Yishmael. Umeis achiv b'lo banim, Shimon dies. So in such a case, since Sarah is chamoso, then there'll be miyun, right? Because when did the miyun take place? Obviously during Shimon's lifetime, otherwise it's not miyun. And then Shimon dies. So at that point, when Sarah falls for Yibum, although she is in some sense Reuven's mother-in-law, but she's not Reuven's mother-in-law at all because Rabbi Yishmael holds that there's miyun on Kedushay Ketana evenly after Shehigya. Okay. So based on this, Tosfos is going to come to the conclusion that we don't accept the Shita of Rabbi Yishmael, and we hold like the Chachamim who descend, and they hold that as soon as she becomes a Gedolah, the marriage matures and there's no possibility of me. So our Mishnah, according to Tosfos, reflects the sheet of the Chacham against Rabbi Shmuel. I'm a little bit bothered by that because if you remember, we're going to have a machlokus in the Gemara that we didn't get to the Gemara, but we mentioned this Gemara already in the past, or whether Bepluta Kamayri or Lo Kamayri. And there was one sheet, I don't know if it was Rava, Bepluta Lo Kamayri, that the Mishnah is universal and there's no dissension. But it could be that machlokus only applies to the first part of the Mishnah. The law of Tzara and Tzaras Tzara and the Arayas. So if you fast forward a little bit, it says V'tirtzu shemishnasenu nemra shelo kishitas Rabbi Shmuel elo kishitas Chachamim she'eni yachol l'mayin ela ad shetagdi. Af l'das ha'omen she'ein ha'mishnah medaberes midvar. Oh, good. He asks my question. What about that man the Omar that bepluta lo kamayri? So why is the Mishnah going against Rabbi Shmuel? Oh, look at that. I didn't cheat. Ein ze el b'minyan tesvav nashim al shar bavos shel Mishnah eino behechrek kidirakol. So in this discussion about whether or not we can have a metzius of tzaras chamoso with a miyun, such that now the tzaras misyabemes, that part of the Mishnah is b'machlokas kamayri, and our Mishnah reflects the sheet of the Chachamim against that of Rabbi Shmuel. Kain haven amar shah b'kushas hatosis v'af v'alpi zeh kosav she'ein zeh elo l'shitas Rabbi Shmuel b'sanhedrin hasover sheyesh kares bechamoso af li achar shemesa ishto. It's very interesting. On the one hand, we're rejecting Rabbi Shmuel in our Mishnah, but on the other hand, we have to be relying on Rabbi Shmuel. There are two different statements of Rabbi Shmuel that are not dependent one on the other. Rabbi Shmuel happens to be the opinion that if Leah, the wife of Reuven, dies, nevertheless, the Erev of Chamoso in the relationship between Reuven and his mother-in-law Sarah continues as a full-fledged Erev with a Chiv Kares. Sharei imbonu lehamid es Chamoso biofen sheyolda es ishto me'achiv. I think the word achiv means Reuven here. We were asking why did we introduce that element of Mesa Ishto that Leah died? Oh, 1 second. No. I thought I had it, a flash. Sharehiniach Baila Zera Acharo. You follow what he's saying? It must be that Leah died. If Leah is still alive, then there would be no Yibum at all, because Shimon was married to Sarah, and Sarah now, together with Shimon, had a baby by the name of Leah. So there's no Yibum. So forget about this whole situation of Sarah and all this. There's nothing going on over here. So it must be that Leah died. And if Leah died, then at the time that Shimon dies, he's left without any children. Which is interesting when you think about it. A man could have 50 million children and still his wife falls for Yibum if never all those children die. Everything is determined at the moment of his death. Achla Rabbi Akiva hasover sham. Okay, that's the sugya in Sanhedrin. Not to be confused with our discussion about whether a gedola is mama'enes or not. But he holds that chamos liachar misas ishto. I think we touched on this Rabbi Akiva in the past. Eno ela belav v'lo b'karis. Once a man's wife dies, then on a kares level, if he were to marry his mother-in-law, he would not be chayiv kares according to it, because the chayiv kares, the full-fledged erva, is generated by the fact that right now he is having a relationship with his wife's mother. If his wife is gone, then we still call her a mother-in-law, but is then benkach eno ptura michalitza. Now that Leah dies, and it has to be that Leah dies, otherwise the whole Parsha of Yibam wouldn't apply. So now the relationship between Reuven and his mother-in-law Sarah is less than that of a Chiyav Kares. And at the very least, he has to give a chalitza, according to Rabbi Akiva. In order to patch up Yitzhar, you have to be in an era of the Chayve Krisos. You didn't Chayve Lavim, Shemana Torah, Olos, Afli Yibu. Is Memela, says the Marsha, our Mishnah must be reflecting the Shita of Rabbi Shmuel, that the Chiyav Kares remains even after, vis-a-vis his mother-in-law, even after his wife dies. Ach lebasof yisik shatosus l'shitosam hikchu shapir afle Rabbi Akiva. Kosvu lahalon she'af Rabbi Akiva lo poter chamos liachar misas ito el misreifa aval kares yeshvo. So this has to do with the sugya later in Yevamos about the question of how Rabbi Akiva changes the status of the Erev of Achoso after the death of his wife. How far did Rabbi Akiva go in that gap between when his wife is alive and when she's gone? According to one approach, he went only one step, and he said that there won't be sreifa in this case. Right? Chamoso is a very severe capital crime, and it generates sreifa, which is, according to at least one Tana, the most severe of all punishments. But after the death of his wife, Rabbi Akiva insists that forget about sreifa. But what do we have instead? We go down one level, we have kares. There's another shita in Rabbi Akiva that Rabbi Akiva went very far, and he said that after the death of his wife, there's not even a chiv kares, there's only an isur la. So this is what we're going to have for today. And let me just make a note of where we got up to. Very liable to forget. It says Office Depot. Is this important? Yeah. Beautiful pen, like they really did a good job. It comes already sharpened. and it comes sharpened?
I sharpen.
Oh. You probably pay extra if it comes sharpened. It's like peeled garlic.
They were
Right, and sharpening.
no. They had.
For both sides, for Yom Rishon, I have two things on the agenda. We'll see which way we go. I want to continue a little bit about Chamoso, which is here on page test. But what I really want to get to, and I might even skip Chamos because I think we did the basics, would be the question of why Achos Isha should be first on the list. The Gemara is absolutely convinced that Achos Isha should be first on the list because the din of all the Arayos is derived from Achos Isha, so she's the paradigmic case. And you'll see on the left column of test that this is going to come under fire. So that's what Emir Hashem will pick up on Yom Rishon. Then